Hi guys, AJ here and welcome back to Contract B. This week is week 4, so it marks 1/3 of the way through the unit already, rather incredibly. This week we're going to be continuing our discussions of the vitiating factors for contracts, and we're going to be looking at 3 nice, neat little concepts, and they are duress, undue influence and unconscionable conduct. Now, just be aware that as we're going through the discussions for this week's vitiating factors, you'll inevitably hark back to some of the other concepts that we've looked at in earlier weeks. Particularly, I'm thinking here of misrepresentation. There's a fair bit of overlap there between misrepresentation and unconscionable conduct, and in fact, both of them were argued in a significant case we'll discuss this week. Also, in this week's materials, duress has a lot of overlap with undue influence, particularly category 1 undue influence. So just bear in mind there are some common threads that we'll pick up, not just between this week's vitiating factors, but also, you'll make some links with some of the previous week's work. So without further ado, let's have a little look at my Prezi presentation for this week's materials. Okay, and here we are at our little Prezi for this week. The first thing I want to draw to your attention is some commonalities between these 3 vitiating factors and some ways to kind of tell them apart, I guess, that might make it a little bit easier to get your head around the concepts. The common thread for all of these 3 is that you're going to have a dominant party and a weaker party. So here we are really looking at an imbalance of some description between one party that's normally the recipient of the benefit of a transaction and the other party that's normally the donor or party providing a benefit or a privilege for the other. In terms of duress, this is a common law action, okay, so that's the first thing you want to know about duress. Often what you'll hear about duress is that the victim's will was overborne by the illegitimate pressure that was applied to him or her. Usually duress will involve some threats, and pretty much over the course of the years the courts have come to recognise 3 different kinds of threat. Threat to person, threat to property, that is usually goods, and threats to one's economic interests. Okay, the kind of pressure is fairly extreme to fall into the category of duress, and it's been described as compulsion, coercion, extortion, exaction, or force. It's that extreme pressure that's brought to bear to make somebody crumble in and sign their life away, sometimes almost literally. Now, in the face of that kind of extreme illegitimate pressure that's brought to bear, courts sometimes say that the victim's will is overborne. And that obviously will make you think of, well, okay, if the victim's will is overborne, do they actually have capacity to contract? Are they capable of assenting to contractual terms? Is there ever going to be consensus ad idem if one of the parties effectively can't choose what they want to do? More often now, rather than saying that duress is a case of a victim's will being overborne, you'll hear courts, particularly in terms of economic duress, you'll hear courts talking about, well, the victim really had no other practical choice but to enter the contract. So they were aware of what they were doing. They had capacity. They understood the choice that was in front of them, but really practically they had no better option than to go ahead and sign on the dotted line. So that's duress. What about undue influence? Well, here again, we're going to be looking at contractual assent because this is one of the hallmarks of undue influence. Now, here we say that contractual assent is affected by the other party's capacity to influence. So you might have influence that is brought to bear by one party over another party. It might not necessarily qualify as one of those extreme threats that you kind of get with duress, but nevertheless, the actual influence used is, so far as equity is concerned, undue. It's improper in some way. So because of this, because of those common situations, those common threads between duress and undue influence, that is the focus on contractual assent and the fact that there's some kind of pressure brought to bear, there is an overlap here. Now, the text says that it may well be the case that duress has been subsumed by the equitable doctrine of undue influence. That may be so, but nevertheless, for the purposes of this term and our discussions here, the courts certainly have not thrown out the baby with the bathwater. There is still a common law action for duress, and there is a separate and equitable concept of undue influence. Now, as I said, there is a focus here as well on contractual assent. Again, you will often hear courts talking about the victim's will being overborne. Don't let that lead you astray from the real focus of what's going on here. And again, more often modern courts will tend to say the victim really had no practical alternative but to choose what they did and to go ahead and enter that contract. So for unconscionable conduct, now here this is another creature of equity, so just bear that in mind. The victim's consent isn't due to threat or illegitimate pressure. The victim's consent really arises because of the nature of their position. They're at some kind of serious disadvantage, or the courts sometimes call it a special disadvantage, vis-a-vis the other person, and then the other person goes ahead and takes advantage of that serious disadvantage or special disability. So the focus is not really on consent here, a little bit like when we were talking about Section 18 of the Australian Consumer Law that looks at misleading or deceptive conduct. The focus is not on the victim here. The focus is on the person that is doing the conduct, that is taking advantage. Okay, so really the thing that separates unconscionable conduct from both duress and undue influence is that focus on the wrongdoer, if you will. Okay, what did they do that was naughty or improper, or as equity would say, unconscientious or inequitable or unconscionable? Okay, so they're our common threads. I'll end this video here for the moment to keep it nice, short, sharp, so that you can keep those concepts crystal clear in your mind, and we'll come back for video 2 on duress.